Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third session of our four-part ITIL webinar series, Change How You Make Changes, presented by the Director of Americas at PeopleCert, David Cannon. My name is Mariela Salinas, and I'll be assisting and moderating our session today. We are in Zoom for today's webinar, and we will be sharing a copy of this recording with you in an email after the session. We do encourage participation throughout the session, so please use the chat or that Q&A option for our short Q&A after the presentation. Educate 360 is so excited to present this webinar today. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, David.
Thank you very much, Mariela, and hi to everybody. Thank you for attending, and thank you to New Horizons for hosting us. We're going to be talking about change today and how we change the way we think about change. There you go. Change how you manage changes. And just a reminder, this is part 3 of a series. You can find the other 2 parts online on the New Horizons website where you registered for this webinar. Let's jump straight into it. We have quite a lot to get through today, as you can imagine. We're taking a vast subject, change enablement and change management, and we're trying to cover a lot of information in just an hour. To do that, I'm going to focus on some of the main points. And the main point is, why does traditional change management not work as well as it should? And how do we do things differently if changes are really important? So 4 sections. We're going to first talk about what was wrong with traditional change management. We're going to look at the question as to, do we really need to manage changes, or can we leave it up to individuals to decide how they're going to do things? And then we're going to look at the approach that has emerged over the last 5 to 10 years, which is change enablement. We'll look a little bit about what the difference is between change enablement and whether change enablement can really help solve some of the issues with traditional change management. Now, as we go into the deck, we have a poll. If you could please just take a minute and answer it. This is really just to get an idea of who is on the webinar, what kind of roles you play. That way we can learn how to better address these webinars in future. So if you could just take a moment to answer that poll, I'll give you just I'll give you a few seconds to go through that. And that was a classic newbie error there. I did not unmute myself, and I just said the most wonderful things, and I can't remember what they were. No, what I was saying is, thank you for completing the poll. I see most of you working in teams that include both IT and business units. You will probably recognize a lot of what I'm going to be talking about. It's no more than real common sense. So you may have discovered a lot of these things for yourself. So view this as a validation for what you've done. For those of you who are working in more of a classic IT role, again, you might have picked up some of these as well. But it's really good to be able to see people from across the spectrum. So let's let's just take that poll down and I will get on with the presentation. So just a reminder of what this series is about. And it's really about people who have defined or maybe inherited a change management process. And that was created some time ago, probably pre-2019, pre-ITIL 4. And as a result, it might either have been based on an older version of ITIL or it might have taken one part of ITIL and ignored others. In fact, I'm going to give you some examples of that in a moment. Some of your processes might have been based on what was common sense at the time. Only as the organization changed, you might find that what worked then is not working as well now. So we're really going to look at the fact that the old ways are not always the best, and that there may be some better ways of managing the whole area around changes. So Shakespeare actually said it best, I think, when he was talking about change management. Of course, he weighed in on the ITIL v zero point 0.5. The evil that men do lives after them, and the good is oft interred with their bones. No, he wasn't talking about change management. He was talking about Julius Caesar. But this sentiment is very true for change management. Or if we want to put it another way, successful changes go by almost unnoticed, but failed changes make the newspapers. And we don't want to be in that situation. It's a sad fact, I think, that the more successful we as service managers are, the less noticeable our contributions are because things just work. But when we get things wrong, everybody notices and it can be catastrophic. So what we want to do is really talk about how we make sure that when we make changes, they are the type of changes that go by almost unnoticed, and not the kind of changes that make the newspapers. How do we do that? Well, first, let's just take a look at some of them. Here we're 2024. I have not included the latest in 2025. There are still some postmortems going on and so on. But just in 2024, the four most notable were are listed here. Significant outages resulting in just a huge financial loss by those organizations, and also losses to their credibility, to their operations, to their ability to provide services to their customers, and so on. So these were all the result of failed changes. Now, I excluded any of the changes that had to do with an incorrect judgment in strategy. So we thought we would go in this direction as a business, and it didn't really work out that well. I've excluded those. I focused only on the changes that had to do with an IT change that had gone wrong. And these are pretty significant. The more your organization relies on digital technology, the higher the profile of failed change will attract. So let's figure out how not to make that happen. So what was wrong with traditional change management? And I have to say at the time, traditional change management worked really well. It was pretty effective. But the environment that traditional change management was designed for was not the same as the environment that we work in today. So if we're going to use traditional change management and we don't adapt it to the way that we work today in a strongly digital, disruptive environment, it's not going to work very well for us. And here's why. Here's what traditional change management looks like, right? So we have two role players, if you like, in this flow chart. We have the person making the change, the changer, and we have this change advisory board. Change advisory board is a hallmark of classic or traditional change management. And in fact, there are organizations today who will say that the only way to do change management is to have a change advisory board and have everything go through the change advisory board. I'm going to challenge that today. I'm going to challenge it for two reasons. One is the change advisory board was never supposed to be the only way that you could manage changes. And secondly, it just doesn't make sense. And I'll show you why in a moment. So here's what traditional change management looks like. So we start with a request for change. That request for change then goes through to a change advisory board or a subset of the change advisory board who will assess the change. And what they're looking for is the impact, the risk, how much it's going to cost, how much effort is it going to take, and is it really worth the investment that we're going to make? They'll then make a go or no go decision. If it's a no go, it gets returned to the requester. By the way, in many practices, we even skipped that assess go no go step. The assessment was done somewhere else in the organization. And by the time it got to the cab, it was just, okay, so when are we going to do it? Don't check whether it's actually going to work or not. Let's just check when it's going to be done. But to be fair, the traditional change management approach is to have a subset of the change advisory board do the assessment. The changer will then build, and when they build a change, they build a testing plan, and they build a backup plan, or could be called a rollback plan. Once they've done that, it goes back to the cab. The cab will evaluate it. Yes, did they build it correctly? Did the QA test work, etc., etc. We then schedule it, and the builder will deploy the change. Once again, testing it, releasing it, and then confirming that it worked or backing out if it didn't. And then the change is reviewed by the change advisory board. Well, in theory, in practice, very few changes actually get reviewed by the change advisory board. So there's really no calculation as to whether the change advisory board's involvement was effective or not. So this is traditional change management. You can probably already see a number of things that are wrong with this, right? So I'm going to point a couple of them out. First of all, it's heavily centralized. In this case, and in fact, in many organizations, all changes have to go through a change advisory board. And even today, I have sat in on change advisory board meetings or change council meetings or whatever you want to call this thing that go through a list of every single change that is made. This could be as small as a configuration change to a server, or it could be as big as the rollout of an entirely new suite of products. Every single one of them goes through that change advisory board. And all stakeholders have to sit in on that meeting. And it could be an hour. Some of them go up to 3 hours every week. And everybody that is nominally a member of that change advisory board has to sit in that meeting. Why? Well, just in case they pick up something that impacts what they do. That's a lot of time. And again, I don't know what your experience has been, but in the past, I've been on change advisory boards with 20 people, 100 people sitting on that call, spending an hour or up to 3 hours going through every single change, just in case there's something that might impact them. What that implies actually is not that it's good change management. What that implies is that there is a lack of knowledge about how the organization works and about how technology works in that organization. You should be able to tell what the impact of a change is going to be without having to send it to everybody that could potentially be impacted. The other thing that you have, because this is so centralized, you have a lot of change administrators. There could be a team of people. Their only job is to process the change request, make sure that they're put onto the agenda for that change advisory board meeting, update the spreadsheet, which you're going to go through on that meeting. But they don't necessarily understand what the changes are that are being processed in the cab. And so really all they're doing is administrative work with very little value added. All this means that changes take a long time to be approved and scheduled. Even if you have a weekly cab, you can have a relatively simple change taking a week just to get approved and then only scheduled. So this didn't really work. It became very, very bureaucratic. The second thing that was wrong with that model was that all the changes are managed the same way. So a routine change, like a server configuration change, to allow a certain activity, for example, which is routine, has the same process that a change to, for example, deploy a security patch would take, or, for example, to release a new version of a piece of software that we subscribe to, or, for example, to manage the acquisition or the onboarding of a new cloud service. All of these changes follow the same basic process, and the same people sit in on the change advisory board to assess all of them. Well, that doesn't make much sense. So, even the other problem is that even minor, well understood changes, changes that happen all the time that, we kind of do in our sleep, these have to be accompanied by vast quantities of documentation, business cases, you name it. Um, and the result of that is very often we just cut and paste stuff. And when we cut and paste stuff, chances are that we're using out-of-date documentation grows. And by the time you realize it, you're 3 generations of change down the road. And when something goes wrong, you're unable to back up to or back out to where you should be because the documentation is out of date. Product builds are treated in the same way as changes in configuration. Well, I covered that. So these, it just doesn't make any sense to manage every single change in the organization in exactly the same way. But that's what we were doing. The scope of the traditional change management process or program was any and all changes. It didn't matter what you were doing. If you changed anything, you had to go through the change advisory board. Um, the CAB members vote on changes, and very often they're voting on changes that they're not even involved in. There are some rules on CAB, just to make it very quick. They say, well, as long as we have a proposer and we have a seconder and we have somebody to support that, we're good to go. So 3 votes and you're good. And then you see people voting that really have nothing to do with the change. They just want the meeting to end. So really, no time to review documentation, no time to review test results. Now, sometimes we don't need to, but sometimes we skip that even when it's important because we just got so many to go through. The impact is not fully described because there's too many participants, not enough time, and we find the process is jammed with zero impact changes and changes to non-controlled items, things that really don't even need to go through change control. We're talking about things like changing out, you know, display units or keyboards or memory chips or whatever the case is. You may or may not be surprised at how many of those things go through cabs. There's just absolutely no need to, unless they're a highly specialized item, where change control is required. But then you know that, and the rules are clear, and we understand why it's at the change advisory board along. It's not buried under all of this other stuff. I'm monitoring the chat there, and yeah, thanks for the comments. Keep them coming, and any questions that you have. I see some of this is resonating with you. Believe me, I'm not inventing this stuff. I lived it. So you're not alone. But there is a way out of this. So the result of all of this is we have high volumes of change requests going through a single process. When that happens, bottleneck, right? Things get slowed down, they become bureaucratic. Changes take a long time. Change advisory board attendees just feel it's a waste of time, but they have to be there in case that one change slips through and fails, and then they get blamed. The level of testing and documentation is way out of proportion with the change. We have too much documentation for simple changes. We have too little documentation where it's really needed. And we have product releases being delayed. We have product teams that are stuck in this logjam, unable to get the next version of their product out, which has critical functionality, which is important for the organization to function. So the organization starts suffering as a result of this. So to overcome this, what we have is an abnormally high number of urgent changes or emergency changes, because that's the only way to get a change through before the change advisory board meets again. And the problem with urgent and emergency changes is the controls tend to be lower. So you find some things slipping through that should not have slipped through. So with that said, one of the questions is, do we really need to manage changes? If change management really is such a problem, do we really need to manage changes? Well, we do. It's not a stupid question, because we've actually had this raised several times as we're going through updating the ITIL books and so on. People have said, really, change management sucks. We shouldn't have it. Let each person decide how they're going to manage the changes that are up to them. And we let goodwill and good intent and trust the disciplines that they have in place to make sure that change works. That doesn't work either. And just to show the benefits of being able to manage changes. First off, improved business operation. We have less disruptions due to change failure. Now, what's interesting about this chart is this was based on some research we did 2 years ago. And what it showed us was two things. One is, the more mature you are, in other words, the more you are practicing and the more people in the organization that are involved in these processes, the more likely you are to get the benefits. So the continuity improved some 49%, improved significantly 31%. You'll see that the maturity of those processes, it was only in the established and innovative and sustainable stages that the benefits really started coming through. So you can't just implement it 1 week and the next week you're having all of these major things. No, this takes discipline. It takes ironing out the kinks to get these kind of benefits. That was the first thing we noticed. But the second thing we noticed was the combination of ITIL practices that was used. I'm gonna show you three benefits that were achieved, and in each of these three, change management or change enablement was one of the key practices that enabled them to achieve this, along with problem management, incident management, and things like availability capacity management. That group of ITIL practices were instrumental in making sure they were able to achieve. And one of the key practices here was change enablement. Interestingly, quality of IT services, you can expect that to happen, because when you have good change enablement in place, you have the right people working on the right things at the right time and at the right pace. So you're able to introduce change where and when it's needed, and you're able to make sure that that change works effectively. So no surprise that change enablement leads to an improvement in the quality of IT services. And the last one I'm going to show you, which was to me the most interesting, maybe even surprising, because we constantly hear that ITIL is really good for the operational aspects of IT, things like fixing stuff that breaks or keeping stuff working the way it should. But we don't often hear people talking about the fact that ITIL practices help them to become more innovative, help them to be able to be more agile and flexible. And yet, that is exactly what we found in this research. 75% of organizations actually benefited from ITIL because it helped them to become more flexible, more agile, more innovative in the way that they worked. And that really made me stop and think, why did that happen? Why did a set of practices that is known for rigor and stability and consistency suddenly lead to this upswing in ability to innovate and be flexible? And it's very simple, really. The you can take a lot more risks if you're able to detect when they go wrong before they go wrong and do something about it. I've heard this analogy used, you probably have too, about the race car. The thing that makes a race car go fastest is the brakes, because you can speed into corners, brake, go safely through the corner, and speed up again. If you have no brakes, you have to keep your speed really low. So change enablement is one of those mechanisms that we use to help us move quickly if we do it right. And that's the big if we do it right. And I think we've all worked for organizations that did not do it right. So, what does doing it right mean? So, yes, we really need to manage changes. The more important questions are which changes? Do we manage all changes? And do we manage all changes in the same way? If we have to manage changes differently, how do we differentiate between different types of change? What level of management is appropriate? Is this really hands-on control, or is this more sort of decentralized, distributed delegation of change, of managing changes? Or is it a combination of those? How do we increase the speed of change while reducing the negative aspect? Because as much as we love to say we want to increase speed of change, we understand that when you do that, you're going to have to reduce something. You're going to have to reduce the time it takes to test. You're going to have to reduce the time it takes to do quality assurance. Can you do that? Is that feasible? Can we increase speed while at the same time improving quality and reducing the impact of negative uh, effects of the change? So let's look at the step that ITIL took in ITIL 4 to move to change enablement. And what we were trying to do was to find a way to answer that question. The question, how do we increase the speed of change by reducing the negative impact? This is one of the key questions that we had to answer. Right. So change enablement focuses on two things, whereas change management really focused primarily on the second one, right? Which was how do we ensure that changes are effective? So we minimize disruption, we eliminate change failure, stay out of the newspapers. With change enablement, we introduce the first set of bullets. They were there, but we didn't really focus as much on them. We focused very much on that second set. The first set of bullets, though, is really important. How do we change at the speed of business? Now, notice what we're saying here. We're not saying, how can you make changes as quickly as possible? That's not the goal. The goal is, how can we make change at the speed of the business? In other words, at the pace that our organization needs us to make changes so that it can reach its objectives. Why the speed of the business? And I see some people in the chat talking about DoD and other government organizations. When we talk about business, we're talking about the operation of the organization that enables it to achieve its objectives, whether they're in the government, whether they're a commercial organization. When we talk about the business in this context, we're really talking about what the organization does to meet its objectives. So we're not trying to move as quickly as possible. We're trying to move at the speed that the organization needs us to. Why does that speed become accelerated? Well, it's because the rate of change in our organizations has accelerated. This is partly because our organizations have been disrupted by digital technology and other influences external to the organization. They've changed because of we need to do things faster because we invest in a technology, and while we're busy implementing it, the new version comes along or an alternative comes along, which totally disrupts and invalidates the thing that we're doing right now. So we need to be able to move really quickly, but not too quickly to outpace what the organization needs us to do. We don't want to be moving faster than the organization. We don't want to be introducing layers of risk in the organization that we don't need to be introducing. So it's about understanding what is the right pace. We need to recognize that if the organization does not change, it becomes irrelevant. If it changes too fast, similarly, it outpaces what people need, what people are using your organization to do. So we've got to get it at exactly the right point. And the other thing that we need to be able to do is make sure that people are aligned. Here's what's happened without us even realizing it over the last 15 years is that organizations have become more and more fragmented. We always thought that digital technology was going to bring us all together. And we're very fond of talking about video conferencing and so on as a way of enabling collaboration. But in fact, what's happened is that very specialized technology has become available to each business unit. And the business units double down on that specialization. And when they do that, they lose touch with what the other business units are doing. So we're going to find a way to bring them all back together again. And we'll talk about this in a moment. That way is really known by different terms. The one that we use in ITIL is called value streams. It's a way of understanding the flow of work between organizations that are very specialized. Change enablement has to be able to do the same thing. It has to be able to bring those groups together so that they can make joint decisions where they need to, or where they need to make specialized decisions so that they can do that as well. So that's what change enablement is about. Let's explore this in a little bit more detail. Here's a definition, if you like. It's a practice. And in ITIL, when we talk about a practice, what we're really talking about is a set of capabilities. And that set of capabilities in ITIL enables us to maximize the number of successful changes to services and products. Services and products, very specifically, note here that we're including the changes that are made by development teams, as well as the changes made by teams that are responsible for ongoing delivery of services. We're not saying that ITIL is in control of development cycles, not at all. We're simply saying that when changes occur in products or when changes occur in services, we have to know about them. We have to be able to enable them to happen at the speed of business. We need to ensure that risks have been assessed and managed. There's no way around this. As much as we want to talk about change enablement, freeing people up to make change, when you make a change, there are risks. The only way we can free people up to make changes is when we can put boundaries around the risk that we're willing for them to take. And if they are over that boundary, being able to put in place some mechanism to evaluate what to do about the situation. You cannot ignore risk. And so change enablement finds a way of assessing and managing risk quickly and effectively. It also makes sure that changes are authorized. Now, it does it very differently than we do in traditional change management. I'll talk about that in a moment. And the other thing we do is manage the change schedule. Now, this is not about managing change scheduling. It's about managing and coordinating how changes are introduced. So to make sure that we do not have changes that are going to throw us off track or that conflict with one another, or which introduce too much change at one time that people in the organization just cannot deal with the amount of change. So it's about making sure that we're introducing changes at the right pace. Very importantly, this is what is very different about change management, traditional change management, is this is about facilitating cooperation and collaboration. Change management, traditional model, was about making sure that changes worked, that they were efficient. How people did it, we didn't care. We had to speak to each other, didn't matter as long as they approved the change, as long as they assessed and approved. We left it up to them to figure out. No, change enablement is about making sure that collaboration is able to happen, making sure that when somebody needs to have a voice in a change, they have that voice, and making sure that they're able to have that voice easily. So just to be clear, it's not a way to let anybody make any changes they want whenever they want to. And that was one of the kind of gaps I think that we saw as we were documenting change enablement. Was there was a tendency in the organization to say, I'm in control of change in my team. Don't mess with what I'm doing. I get to make my decisions about my changes in the way I want to, and I will release them when I'm ready. That doesn't work. We've proved again and again that that doesn't work. Collaboration and cooperation is essential. The question is, how can we make it easy? How can we make it part of the culture of the organization? So I'm going to explore the answers to that question in quite a bit of detail, but three things that will make change enablement effective. First, changes happen in the context of value streams, not systems. So if you are simply applying change management to the system that is under your control, yeah, you probably have good changes in the system, but you have no idea how they impact anybody else. Unless your system is set up to define those those interfaces. So in which case your change management will only evaluate the impact on those interfaces. But the broader impact of the change on the culture of the organization, the way in which the organization works, you won't have any idea. No, it's better to work in the context of value streams. In other words, who is going to be impacted by this change, either positively or negatively? Who's going to be involved in making the change? Who's going to be involved in checking that all of the dependencies are taken care of? It requires an understanding of the end-to-end nature of services. And I'll give you an example in a moment. Secondly, changes are managed in multiple ways, and they are managed in multiple parts of the organization. There is no one size fits all. That's traditional change management. We don't want that. What we want is the ability of people to make changes in a way that enables them to do what they need to do, yet at the same time enables them to comply or to contribute to effective deployment of those changes so that there are no change failures. And then thirdly, there must be a balance between the effectiveness of the change, in other words, what it achieves, the amount of throughput, in other words, how much work can we actually get done, the compliance, what are the boundaries, and risk control. How do we avoid introducing risk unnecessarily? So we have to balance all of those. So in other words, if you want to put it a different way, we have to look at both the negative and the positive potential outcomes of changes as we're managing those changes. So those are the three things that an effective change enablement practice depends on. Right. So you can see the collaboration, cooperation happening there. You can see the fact that different kinds of changes on different teams, different parts of the organization get managed effectively. But you can also see that there's a good way of balancing so people can make good decisions about the changes that they're introducing into the organization. Here's an example of what I mean by value stream. I've just taken one at random. It's kind of a universal one. This is the onboarding value stream. Some people may argue about whether that's a value stream or not. Here's what I mean by value stream, just for the purpose of this presentation. A value stream is an end-to-end set of activities that produce something that is valuable to the organization, but which depend on the simultaneous functioning of multiple teams and multiple processes at the same time. Right? So here we have a very simple value stream. You can change the names. This is not authoritative, right? This is just an example. We hire somebody, they join the company, we equip them with the tools that they need to do the job. We then orient them, training typically, introduce them to their team, and then they integrate into business as usual. They become a part of the organization and they do the work that they have been hired to do. Right, pretty common value stream there. There are arguably at least three parts of the organization that are involved. You may argue that there are more, but there is at least that hiring manager in their organization. There is the HR team, and of course, there is this generic group called IT, which in reality might be several groups. To make sure that that onboarding value stream works effectively, we need these three groups to collaborate. But what we also need is we need the benefit of at least three different processes. We have service request management processes, we have change enablement processes, and we have IT asset management processes. And note, I'm using the term process here, not practice. I'm specifically talking about the workflows, right? Practice includes the people and the tools and so on. Here I'm talking specifically about the process. So we have service request management coming. Hiring manager says, I'm going to need these services for when this person joins us. Change enablement kicks in and says, okay, well, we're going to need to make some changes. I see that you have an exception here. You need this person to have a little bit different than the standard image. Okay, we're going to have to do some, we're going to have to make sure that that can happen. And then IT asset management gets involved because they're the ones who have to create the image and configure the equipment. Maybe that's configuration management. Maybe there's a fourth process here, however you've organized it, right? But all three of these processes have to work together. All three of those teams have to work together in order for that value stream to be effective. So this is what we mean by the change enablement practice needing to work within the context of a value stream. So you may decide that there is a change that needs to be made here when that person joins. There may be a change that is made here between orientation and integration. Maybe in orientation, we give them some tools to play with. They're in a sandbox environment. But when they start doing their real job, we actually turn on certain access. So maybe there's an additional change that's required there. So change enablement actually happens twice, maybe even three times through this value stream. We may find that change enablement on the first change requires input from all three of the departments, but maybe on the integration stage only requires input from HR and IT or just IT. What we've done here is we have mapped how to use change enablement effectively to support a valuable business activity. Not all of the changes that we do will be mapped to value streams. Some of them will be mapped to products, and I'll give you an example of that in a moment. That moment being now. Oh, bit of an eye chart. I cut and paste this out of the ITIL practice guide, just so you know. What I'm showing here is that different parts of the organization will manage changes in different ways. So the one that we're probably most familiar with are the changes that happen here in the business as usual environment, right? This is, we need to change the settings on a network switch, or we need to change some access to give somebody access to a new service that they didn't have before, right? So these are things that we're changing in the current business as usual environment. Then we have projects at the top here. This is a large scale waterfall project. We may be introducing a new, building a new data center or moving everybody from one headquarters office to a new headquarters office, right? So there's huge projects going on, and those projects involve multiple changes. The authority for those changes is held here at the project or program management level. So the ultimate authority in which changes are made, when they're made, and how they're made happens here at the project level. Of course, everybody who is involved in making those changes will be represented in that project. So we have the voice. So in effect, what happens is the project team becomes the change advisory board. Oh, okay. Here's another variation on that. Here we have a product team. It says major change. Actually, this product is something that is continually evolving and improving over time. So we have multiple changes happening at every sprint. But again, excuse me, the changes that happen here are managed under the mandate of that particular product. I just wanted to use that as illustration. How we work this out in real life, of course, is a lot more complex. But just to point out that it is really important to make sure that the authority for change and the ability to make changes happens at the right level, in the right part of the organization. It's a very key part of change enablement. Now, that's not to say it happens all on its own. I mentioned that before. So how do we get this to work? And how does ITIL help? Well, all of this comes out of ITIL. The first thing is there should be a unified vision for change enablement. There needs to be a common understanding of what it means to make changes. It doesn't matter where you work. Excuse me. You could be on an agile team working on a project. You could, or on a product. You could be on a project team that's working on this large migration project. You could be on a network operations team who's making changes to network configuration. It doesn't really matter. You should all have the same understanding of what a change is and what it takes for a change to be successful. And this needs to be set at the highest level. We're talking CIO, if not even higher than the CIO, because you have multiple parts of the organization working together outside of IT as well as inside IT. So at the most senior level, there should be this common vision of change. How do we make changes? What is the way that we make decisions? How do we allocate resources that need to build and test and deploy these changes? So here are the things that should be in this vision. And I don't know what your organization would, what format this vision would be in. It could be a policy document. It could be, part of your standard training. It could be a standard. It could be something that is measured in terms of compliance. It all depends on how your organization functions. But at a minimum, you should be able to agree across the organization what are the minimum requirements for every change. Do they have to be tested? Do they have to be documented? Do they have to be tracked in a system? It will vary. It just depends. And you may have different types of change with different requirements at each level. That needs to be understood across the board. It doesn't matter whether you're sitting on an agile product team or whether you're sitting in a data center on a network operations center. You should have a common understanding of what effective changes consist of. There needs to be a common language because otherwise, how do you communicate across different groups? Right, in ITIL, very often you hear the term normal change being used. I don't like that term, by the way, normal change, like change. Yeah, I understand what you're saying. It's kind of change that happens all the time. We understand how to manage it. It's not something that's disastrous or happened because somebody did something wrong. But be more granular than that. What are the categories that you use for changes? How do you evaluate whether a change is organization wide or just between two groups? There need to be rules for deciding when a change could be managed inside a team or whether it needs to be communicated and collaborated across multiple teams. How are changes coordinated when more than one team is involved? Right? We've already said you don't want one single cab for the entire organization for every single change. But should there be mini cabs? Should there be specific councils or boards that are involved when specific types of changes are made that involve a subset of the organization? These rules need to be defined. And if there somebody's telling me I need to get a move on here. Bus outside getting stuck in traffic. Apologies for the noise. So are there any standards or compliance or reporting requirements that need to be made? If you're dealing with systems that are subject to a SOC audit, for example, you're going to need to show the change records to that system. And everybody needs to understand that, right? This is why I'm doing it, because of compliance. Second thing, every change must have an owner. Why? Well, there's too many changes that kind of, you know the saying, success has many parents, but failures die orphans. Is exactly that. No, there has to be somebody accountable for that change. You cannot just have changes being proposed and everybody gets around a campfire and sings and magically the change happens. No, somebody has to own and drive that change. If there is a decision about needing to spend more money on that change, somebody with the authority to spend that money has to be involved. Now, there may be multiple roles. So, there may be a business user or a business leader. There may be a development team leader. There may be an operations team leader that collaborated and together they decided that this change needs to happen. But only one of them can be the owner of that change. This helps us to facilitate decision making. It helps us get the resources we need when we need them. And very importantly, it avoids that time-consuming and demotivating blame allocation when things are not working. And by the way, blame allocation doesn't just happen after failure. It happens when resources aren't available. It happens when we can't do the testing in time. Every time one of these steps goes wrong, everybody's, oh, it wasn't me. I'm not the owner. I'm not responsible. You have a change owner, you have one person responsible. So every change has an owner. The third thing is every change has a change authority. Now, it can be a change advisory board, but it doesn't have to be. And in fact, in many cases, it will not be a change advisory board. In ITIL version 1, they use the term change advisory board as a virtual term, kind of just a concept. It got turned into an organization structure very quickly. So what we need here is a change authority. The type of change will determine who the change authority is, right? It is a person or a group. It could be an individual or it could be a group of people who are best situated to evaluate the impact, the cost, the effort of the change and make sure that everything that is required for that change to be successful is in place. So change authorities must reflect the type and the scope of change. In a product development team, the change authority is likely to be a combination, a board of the product owner and the product manager, and possibly some stakeholders outside of the project team or the product team, where there are dependencies. So if there's a dependency on network bandwidth, for example, making sure the network manager is there. But it needs to reflect the type and scope of change. It's not all people for every change. The next thing that is needed is change models. This was introduced in ITIL v2, and it has probably been the simplest thing, but the most difficult to apply. This is just, I guess people get hung up on model. A better way of saying it is a way of managing changes that are similar. So if over time we notice that certain changes always get managed in the same way by the same people, well, let's group them together and let's create a standard workflow for those changes and let's automate the allocation of those changes. Don't have to go through a cab. We don't have to go through, hey, who do you think should be involved? No, it just goes through to the right people at the right time. They get on with the work. There may be some authorization involved. The change model will tell you who the authorizing person should be, the change authority. So a change model is more than just a category. It can include a predefined workflow that is automated in the ticketing tool that you're using. It can include a predefined change authority. It can include any templates that you need to make the change. Maybe it involves purchasing new equipment, in which case there's a template for that and instructions on how to complete that template so that you get the equipment you need. There's a list of groups or individuals that need to be involved and anything else that's important for you to be able to make this change. The important thing about change models is it's not a define once and forget about them. You review them regularly. Why? Because change models sometimes have to be changed. And anything that is controlled that needs to be changed needs to go through change enablement. So you need to make sure that that change model will continue to work even if it has been updated and changed. A type of change model, more than a change model really, is this thing called the standard change. And by the way, this is one of the quickest ways to get efficiency in your change enablement practice. Change models and standard changes, the quickest way to get some short-term wins to speed up and make your change enablement practice more effective. A standard change is a change that we understand so well and it is so frequent that it is pre-authorized. Some people, it depends on whether you include this as a service request or a change or an incident, but some people include things like password resets as a standard change. Going to happen all the time. We don't need to go to a cab to let a user change their passwords. There are some checks that we go through. Are they still employed by us? Do they have legitimate access to the systems they're asking for? Call, will reset their password. All of that is included in the standard change. We can even automate standard changes. That's really cool. We didn't even have to go through to an individual or a person. as long as we keep updating the standard changes and making sure that they continue to be relevant to what we're doing. Testing, quality, and documentation is essential. Now, the level of testing, the level of quality assurance, and the level of documentation will vary by change. In some cases, it's just a matter of somebody looking over the shoulder of the person making the change and saying, "Yep, that works," and then updating the ticket. That could be all that's required. In other cases, it involves a full 2-week long test in a laboratory with simulated use cases and documented test plans and so on. It all depends on the kind of change that you're managing. But all of them need to be done in some form or fashion. Also, just a note, when you're testing, please test the backout plan or the rollback plan. We already have significant issues. We've come across them. The latest one that everybody's complaining about right now is the release of ChatGPT that superseded all the versions before it, and there's no ways to get back to them. It's a bit of an extreme case, but you get the idea. Here's a helpful one that I found working in a couple of organizations. They use what they call a 2I or a 3I approach. These are for sort of more routine kind of changes, things that are made on a daily basis. They're not major impact, but they need to be done, things like maintenance activities and so on. 2I approach is basically the person who makes the change gets somebody in the team to double check on them. Can you confirm this is working? Did I do the right things? Did I miss anything? No. Okay, we're good. A 3I approach is when it's a little bit more complex and you want somebody that's independent to come in and make sure that just because you know the system so well, you didn't take any shortcuts, that you didn't miss anything out. So 2I or a 3I approach is a really good way of doing testing, doing quality control, and speeding up the change enablement practice. Again, just be very careful that you're not using a 3I approach when you actually need a full collaboration between multiple team leads. I've mentioned this already. I just wanted to include this for completeness, that changes in product or project teams will be managed under the control of those teams. They very often do not come out into change advisory boards. They do need to be scheduled, but we rely on communication and we rely on that team working within their mandate. In other words, what we've agreed they're going to be developing. They want to introduce any radically new functionality. They want to introduce any dependencies that were not there before. Then we require them to step outside of their internal processes and get the collaboration of the teams that are involved. So some next steps as we end. I did want to just announce that New Horizons is adding, as of September 1st, any foundation course that you take, you will be given a PeopleCert Plus membership. PeopleCert Plus includes access to all of the ITIL books and practice guides, access to webinars that are not publicly available. You get a free take two, so that if you fail an exam, you get to take the second one for included in the cost, etc., etc. So really good value here, and it is being given to you in the cost of your foundation. In other words, it's being given for free. So thank you to New Horizons for doing that. It's really cool. I tell you, that is one of my favorite my favorite products when it comes to ITIL, apart from the books themselves. It's really cool. And for those of you who now want to run out and take a course, here are the guaranteed to run courses for foundation and for the plan, implement, and control, which includes change enablement. So I want to thank you all for your time. If there are questions, I have been monitoring. Yes, you do get PDUs for this. Please enter it in your PeopleCert Plus membership. Absolutely. Other than that, if you have questions, please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm there. Welcome any discussion or points that you want to make, or reach out to email to the organizers and they will forward to me. I'd like to thank you all very much for your time, and back to Mariella.
Awesome, David. Thank you so much for this awesome intro and fantastic info. If anyone here needs a little bit more info on the topic or wants to learn a little bit more about our other four-part series, our other two parts that we had before today, you can go right ahead and click on the links I dropped in the chat or visit us at newhorizons.com. So, yeah, we have a little bit of everything here, a free resource, some extra sessions, and a little bit more info on ITIL. And just to be mindful, I want to thank you all so much for joining us today, but I'll go ahead and end it here. And yes, it absolutely will qualify for one PDU under ways of working. So, alrighty. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us. And as always, thank you, David.
Thank you.
Alrighty. Have a fantastic rest of your week. We'll hopefully see you all very soon in the classroom or in that next session. Bye for now.